My name's Tony Biglan. I've been a scientist at Oregon Research Institute for 35 years. Thanks to advances in behavioral science, we have figured out how to prevent most of the critical problems facing us. I began my study of psychology in the 1960s. I was inspired by people like Bobby Kennedy, who challenged young people to make a difference.
I come to you today to say that we can build a newer and better nation. I say we can do so, that we must do so, and that we will do so.
In the 60s, we had optimism, attitude, and motivation. What was missing was science. But over the past 50 years, we've learned how to ensure that just about every child thrives. First, children need safe and caring environments. We need to keep anger, criticism, and threat to a minimum. The second thing that makes us thrive is positive reinforcement. I'm not talking about M&Ms or money. I'm talking about attention, listening, smiling, touching, hugging, approval, and warmth. All vital ingredients to keep people persevering, innovating, caring for others, learning new things. We thrive on reinforcement. Science shows that even problems that seem intractable can have simple solutions. Consider John Snow. In 1854 in London, England, he proved that cholera was due to contaminated water. When he got the town to remove the Broad Street pump handle, the cholera epidemic ended. A deadly disease that had killed thousands of people over hundreds of years was stopped by a simple solution. So what is our pump handle? Is there a simple solution that could prevent the psychological and behavioral problems that have plagued us for centuries? The answer is nurturance. The school and family programs we've developed over the past 40 years nurture young people's development while preventing the most common and costly psychological and behavioral problems. But research also shows that our families and schools will never become as nurturing as they could be unless we evolve our capitalist system so that it serves the well-being of everyone. We have more people living in poverty than any other developed country and historic levels of economic inequality. These conditions strain families, increase conflict, and directly contribute to poor health and even suicide. Now we're beginning to see a growing number of people who understand that we must have an economic system that works for everyone. We have the knowledge we need to build the better world that Robert Kennedy challenged us to create. I'm really an optimist. I think that we have the science to ensure that virtually every young person arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, health habits, and values they need to live a productive life in caring relationships with other people. I was the president of the Students for Robert Kennedy at the University of Illinois in 1968. And I awoke on my birthday on June 6, 1968, to the news that he had died that night. It was very difficult. I went to his funeral in Washington. And you may not be a Democrat or, think much of Robert Kennedy, but to me at the time, he was somebody who was concerned about the well-being of poor people, white people, black people, and it was a time when poor white people and poor black people were together in a way that I think they haven't been ever since. But I went on not to be a politician, but to be a behavioral scientist, and I wrote this book because I felt like I got into this field at a time when we really didn't have any interventions. I mean, in 1968, there wasn't a single randomized trial evaluating, showing that this works better than that. And what we've accumulated over the last 40 years is, I think, really quite significant. We take for granted how science has changed our world. I flew here in 2.5 hours from Eugene, Oregon this morning. In 1850, it would have taken me 2 or 3 months. It would have taken, it took a couple months to get a letter from Utah to California. And then there's the example of cholera, where in London, England, which is the largest and wealthiest city in the world in the 19th century, in the first half of that century, 100,000 people in England died of cholera. They had no idea what caused cholera. The common understanding was that it was miasma, which is bad air. And people were so afraid of this that they would close up their houses so that they wouldn't have this bad air come in. And of course, there wasn't a sewage system, and so what happened was that people's sewage went to the basement, and then every week or so somebody would come and they'd shovel it out and take it out as manure into the fields, right? And so some people died of methane poisoning because they had closed up their house. I mean, the science, we just didn't know. The sewage system in London, England, some sewage would empty into the Thames upstream from the pipes that took the water in to drink. This was the, let's see, we'll turn that on. This is the, I'm going to enjoy this too. This is the famous ghost map that Stephen Johnson wrote about John Snow's work. And this is Broad Street, and there's the Broad Street pump. And all of these hatch marks are deaths. And he and a minister went around to this whole neighborhood where over 500 people died, just finding out where people had died. And they noticed that the deaths tended to be clustered around the Broad Street pump. There's another pump here, and there's a pump here. And there were more deaths here. This, by the way, was a brewery. Guess what they were drinking? And so he convinced them to change to stop making that water available. And the deaths stopped. And it took another 50 years before all of the developed world was kind of into sanitation, but they got better and better. And it was still 1920 when in Paris, before they got all the sewage going into a sewage system and separating it from the drinking water and so on. But I submit that what we have learned over the last 40 years about human well-being is as solid as the evidence that we have about the harmfulness of contaminated water. And that when we have that knowledge, we can change the world with respect to the well-being of children and adolescents. And by the way, if you want to change the well-being of children and adolescents, you've got to change the well-being of everybody, because the people who aren't well off won't treat kids very well. That we can change that. And in fact, let's see. This is probably later, but the vision of the Institute of Medicine that reviewed the evidence that I'm describing and that I describe in my book concluded that we have the knowledge in principle to ensure that virtually every young person, or if we make use of this, if we figure out how to really make this available, if we build the sanitation system for the well-being of children and adolescents, that we can ensure that virtually every young person arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, and health habits they need to lead a productive life in caring relationships with other people. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about briefly are just give you a sort of overview of the things that we've learned. But I also I'm going to spend a lot more time than I did in Denver. You Boulder people get a special treatment here. On this issue of caring relationships, because I think caring relationships, building caring relationships, is fundamental to everything else we need to do. And so let me first talk about human conflict, which I think is the fundamental process driving most problem development. A person who's been a mentor and a hero to me is a guy named Jerry Patterson, who's a psychologist in Eugene, Oregon, who's now 85 years old or so. And what he started doing when he started studying families was he went into families and he would study the interactions between aggressive kids and their parents, because he was trying to figure out, well, why do kids become aggressive? He'd already shown that some of these positive reinforcement programs could help kids to be less aggressive, but why did they become aggressive in the first place? And so he had people go in and code the moment-to-moment interactions between the kids and other family members and between different kids. And what he found was that when a child in a family with an aggressive kid, that in those families, people were using aversive, coercive, nasty, critical, teasing, put-downs, all of those kind of behavior to control each other. And so a mom might say, I want you to go to bed. And the kid says, I don't want to. And so mom would just keep, come on, you need to go to bed, you need to go to bed, you need to go to bed. And eventually the kid screams and mom backs off. Well, what just happened? Well, the kid just got reinforced for screaming, okay? He learned that if he just raises the ante enough, other people will back off. What did mom learn? If I back off, he'll stop screaming, right? Nobody's getting skills that they can really use, but people are using this aversive behavior to control each other. And so, when Jerry started this, no one would have thought that these mundane little negative interactions could lead to some kids becoming career criminals. But that's in fact what he found. And he did longitudinal studies where he followed these kids into adulthood and found that the kids who learned to be aggressive and didn't learn the nicer social graces in the interactions with their family, they got to school. And when they got to school, teacher said, well, it's time to sit down and open your book. Kid didn't want to do it, didn't do it. And so he wasn't learning as much. And he learned that if you really got pushy, you could get things you wanted. And so he was aggressive with other kids. Guess what? Other kids didn't like him. So he got rejected. So he's not learning. He's not developing friends. Now we have a host of studies that have followed these kids into early adolescence. They get to middle school. They're rejected by other kids. So what happens? Well, there are other kids who've been rejected by other kids, and they get to know each other. And there are actual studies that show that when these kids together, it's magic. Here's a kid who's laughing at my nasty talk and so on. And so this is the development of deviant peer groups, and it's in the deviant peer groups that these kids start to practice delinquent behavior and substance abuse and risky sexual behavior. And in fact, one of the things we've learned is that kids who are on this kind of pathway are significantly more likely to have children early on. And now think about that from an evolutionary perspective. In a threatening world, you better have your baby soon because you may not be around. And so there's in fact seems to be an evolutionary process in which people who are in threatening environments are more likely to get on this pathway to engaging in these kinds of behaviors that ultimately lead to having kids sooner because for evolutionary reasons. There have also been studies of marital discord, and guess what? This same kind of conflict is operative in marital discord. Each member of the dyad gets good at using things like not talking to the other person, or yelling, or putting down, or teasing, and so on, and that's predictive of couples divorcing. And the good news is that there are ways of helping them to develop the more positive kinds of things. We even did a study of the interactions of depressed women and their families, and what we found, we went in just like Jerry Patterson did, and we studied the moment-to-moment interactions of depressed women and their family members, and what we found was that when a mother who was depressed acted in depressed ways, it briefly led to other family members backing off, stopping being aggressive. And so no one was having fun, but mom was getting a brief respite from the aversive behavior of other people by being depressed. So this form of human conflict is fundamental to our figuring out how to deal with this is fundamental to creating a society in which people develop successfully and care for each other. Another thing I want to say about this is that I was asked to brief the National Prevention Council about these issues, about prevention. The National Prevention Council was created under the Affordable Care Act to figure out what we can do to prevent the really important diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer and so on. And so they invited us to come and talk, but their expectation was, well, these kids end up smoking, they end up using drugs, and that puts them at risk. But that's not all we've learned. It turns out that these kinds of conflict-filled environments get under kids' skin and create and make it more likely that these kids will have problems as adults. And so one of the studies I found was a meta-analysis of 24 studies. Adults with a history of maltreatment were 2 3/4 times more likely to have a stroke or myocardial infarction as adults. And then there are studies of poverty that show that kids raised in poverty have a 20 to 40% increased risk of all-cause mortality and a 30 to 60% increased risk of cardiovascular disease as adults. And they've even done studies where they had kids who were poor as kids, and by adulthood they'd gotten education and they were doing okay, and they matched them to people who were doing, same income and so on, but hadn't been raised in poverty. And the ones who were raised in poverty still had a 24 to 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So poverty is a public health problem. If you don't care about those people that are living in poverty, but you want a healthier population, if you want lower health care costs, you should care about those people. The other thing about it is that it turns out that if you follow these, you find these kids who were raised in poverty and now they're adults and so on, if they say that their mothers were nurturing, this effect goes away. In other words, having a nurturing mother, even when you were raised in poverty, seems to prevent you from having this kind of physiological response that leads to cardiovascular disease. Does that make sense? Clear? Okay. So, how and why our minds get in the way. A good friend of mine, Kelly Wilson, likes to say that it's better to miss lunch than to be lunch. If you've ever seen a rabbit eating veggies, it's a little like this. It's right? And why are they doing that? Because there might be a cougar in the bushes, right? And so they're looking up, make sure, right? I mean, my domesticated cats that love me, you walk by them when they're eating, they'll look up, right? It's better to miss lunch than to be lunch, right? Well, now think about that from an evolutionary perspective. The bunnies that just kept eating, they didn't survive. The bunnies that went like this survived. If someone walked in this room and fired a gun into the ceiling, I would go away. You would be completely focused on what's going on, how do I get out of here, how do I survive? Our first move is to be sure that we're safe. Then we can relax and we can take care of other things. This is the physiological stress response. There's a wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. This book's about this thick, and it's a compendium of all of the ways in which stress harms people. And the way it works is that there's a stressor. Let's say the zebra sees a lion, and that produces a cascade of hormones that results in the zebra having a higher heart rate, higher blood pressure, and being ready to either run like hell or fight. And if you're a zebra and it's a lion, it's probably best to run. So Jim and John are out in the woods and they get to talking about what would you do if a cougar shows up, and John says, well, you're supposed to stand there and be big and not back down. And Jim says, well, I just run like hell. And John says, you think you can outrun a cougar? He says, no, but I think I can outrun you. And as I've studied this, I've found myself feeling like when you really understand this, then what it makes me feel is that we need to care for people and just like give them a hug if that's what works. I got one son, this is about the best you can hug them, but you need to give people what they need to feel comfortable. And hugging an HPA axis isn't very appealing, so this is my son and his son. There's a little better image of what we're looking for. Threat rewires the brain for evolutionary reasons. Genetic, epigenetic, neuroscience, all the research seems to come together to show that in environments that are stressful and threatening, it impairs self-regulation. That's the first problem, that kids don't learn to withhold their immediate impulse, and they are quick to do things that cause problems. Kids who are in threat are hypervigilant. If I read you as, well, that's an angry face, then I may behave differently toward you. But if it's a dangerous world, I might be safer if I'm quick to react with aggression. On the other hand, if I'm misreading your face, I just missed the opportunity to have a friend, and I continue in an environment that continues to be threatening. So one of the things we find is that this pattern of behaviors further increases the chances of further stress and further physiological harm. But I've already talked about this cascade of problems, so I'm going to go on from there. And that I've already talked about. This is a chart from the Institute of Medicine report on prevention. And this is the Institute of Medicine report on prevention that suggested that we really do have the science to make a difference. These are the developmental phases, and every one of these bracketed items refers to one or more interventions that have been shown to have benefit. And I'll say three things about them. One is that most of them have been shown to have an effect long after the problem the intervention was provided. So for example, there are home visiting programs like the Nurse-Family Partnership. How many know about the Nurse-Family Partnership? Yes, well, it's Colorado can be proud that this is the home of the Nurse-Family Partnership. One of the things we found with the Nurse-Family Partnership is that the benefits are found even into adolescence, despite the fact that the program ends at age 2. There are early childhood interventions, parenting skills interventions, social skills, prevention of depression, even prevention of schizophrenia, which I didn't know when I got on the committee that wrote this report. And there are preventions focused on specific adversities like bereavement, divorce, parental psychopathology, community interventions, and there are also policies that may not directly be somebody getting to an individual, but that make a difference. So one of the things I did after I was on this Institute of Medicine committee was to start to think about, well, what are the key features of environments that help people to develop successfully? And the first one is I pretty much talked about. We need to minimize toxic social and biological conditions. Biological conditions are things like too much omega-6 on the diet. You know about omega? Raise your hand if you take omega-3 supplements. Okay. There's omega-3 supplements. I sell these to you, but I need them to get through this week. I had pork today. I don't know why I had that. And then I had a Manhattan. And then I completely revised this talk between my 3 o'clock talk and this talk, because Beverly started talking to me about this stuff. And so I completely revised the talk, and I had a little something to eat, and I had a Manhattan. And I stood up and I went, oh my God, I'm at 6,000 feet. So I went back and took a 10-minute nap, but I think I'm okay. You can judge for yourself. So the second thing is to teach, promote, and richly reinforce diverse forms of pro-social behavior. And I'm not just talking about M&Ms and money. I'm talking about, you're looking at me, you're listening to me, I'm being reinforced, right? Reinforcement is just interactions of positive kind that say you're safe and you're well and so on. That's fundamental. And if you look inside every one of these interventions, you will find that they do these things. They minimize these toxic conditions, and they greatly help increase reinforcement. Those interventions that were developed around aggressive kids, that's where these family interventions came from, or the studies that Jerry Patterson was doing in families. Those interventions teach parents to replace their use of coercive behavior with positive reinforcement, with listening to kids, with praising kids, with providing extrinsic rewards if that's necessary. And then there's limit influences and opportunities for problem behaviors. And influences are things like the marketing of cigarettes and alcohol and unhealthy foods. These are practices that there's substantial evidence that they contribute to harm to kids, and so we need to limit those influences. We also need to prevent opportunities for problem behavior, like kids getting together after school with no adults around. That's a training ground where kids start to experiment with many kinds of things, including having babies. And then we need to promote psychological flexibility, which is a mindful approach to pursuing values. And that's what I want to talk about in a little bit of detail. So I'm going to skip this because I already pretty much said it and get to this. Suppose that the wide variety of consequences of trauma are all for the purposes of avoiding distressing experience. So now I'm talking about, I've described these families that these kids are growing up in that are coercive, that are conflict-filled. And by the way, I'm not just talking about beating kids. I'm not talking about just the worst kinds of neglect. There's even research that if you simply criticize children, that affects their brains. There are differences between kids who are criticized by parents without any hitting or neglect and kids who aren't criticized in terms of their brain functioning. That itself gets under the skin. And I will tell you that I've done workshops and I've been in a lot of workshops with psychologists where this is a huge thing, that people go, I'm not good enough. Where did they get that? There are people graduated from Harvard University. I'm not good enough. Well, look around. There are all these people who got better grades than I did, I mean, there's all, social comparison is just built into to human language. And so there's always somebody. Is Bill Gates in the room? Right? I mean, some of you are a lot wealthier than others, but Bill Gates comes into the room, or Warren Buffett, and you're not rich enough. I mean, you cannot win that contest. And if being better than other people is important, which it hugely is, and for completely reasonable reasons. I play basketball 3 times a week, and there are younger people, I don't like that very much, and there are taller people, I don't like that very much, and so I could stop playing, because I'm often the worst guy. The younger guys now are very, oh, good, if I make a shot, oh, good, But it's hard, but it's better than sitting at home getting fat, and I still enjoy it, But you will always lose that race. And so the answer isn't to, and you see people who are just absolute workaholics, and they're working so hard, and they're doing so well, and, they got all A's, and, oh, they did get into Harvard, and, all these, and it's just never enough, because it's, oh, I got to be better. Well, and what drove you to work hard and stay up and study for that? Well, he got a better grade than I did. I can't have that. I have to keep working, and you keep working, and you just cannot win that. Anyway, suppose that wide variety of consequences of trauma are all for the purposes of avoiding distressing experience. Is it possible that the problem behaviors that we see are to a great extent engaged in to damp down the thoughts and the feelings that people have that they don't want to have? So drinking, taking drugs, getting angry. I'll give you something to cry about, Oh, this kid isn't crying anymore, Oh, that makes me feel better. My anger worked. I just got reinforced for being angry. Or I just got reinforced for getting drunk or taking drugs or avoiding difficult situations. I haven't talked to my father in 20 years. Because he was a mean bastard, and I haven't talked to him in 20 years. Well, I've worked with people like that, and is that working for you? I mean, do you feel fulfilled? Do you feel happy about that? No, but I've avoided that unpleasantness with Dad, and the stuff I'm going to talk to you about has led people to actually get so that they were willing to have the feelings that they would have, so they could go and talk to Dad and say, Dad, you weren't very good to me, and I love you, and it hurt me, and I want to have this conversation. And maybe Dad says, I don't want to have it. Well, okay, but I tried, right? So this is about not avoiding those things. Staying in bed, common thing for people who are depressed. Just stay in bed, because to get out of bed, well, short term that make you feel better. But I submit that you stay in bed day after day, probably not a good idea. Worrying, that's a good one. You just worry and worry and worry about things, and you get them done, right? I had a client who, she'd get up on a Saturday morning and she'd see, I think I need the porch painted. Yeah, I should probably paint the porch. Oh, it's bad. It's flaking, and I really. By noon, she's at the paint store. She didn't plan to do this, but by noon she's at. Her worrying was actually quite functional, because don't we all worry, right? Oh, I've got to get this by 10 o'clock, and I mean, worrying is often very functional, right? But her life was just built around worrying. And it's avoiding the distress of having this porch that isn't the best porch in the community. Self-denigration. Oh, I'm not very good at that. Well, what's that about? Very often that's about, don't you criticize me, I beat you to it, you know. Complaining. That often works. It gets sympathy, you know, and gets people off the thing that they were worried about. So here's these are 4 items from a questionnaire called the Acceptance and Action Questionnaire. I am able to take action on a problem even if I'm uncertain what is the right thing to do. This is a measure. These items are examples of, I think it's an 8-item scale. And these are examples of items that have to do with experiential avoidance. And what experiential avoidance is the tendency to want to avoid unpleasant thoughts and feelings. And the theme I'm pursuing here is that this is sort of very common for human beings to be motivated to not want to have thoughts and feelings that bother them. And so if I say I'm able to take action on a problem, even if I'm uncertain, that means they're not experientially avoidant. They're willing to go ahead and do it despite the fact that I'm not sure this is going to work. You know? When I feel depressed or anxious, I'm unable to take care of my responsibilities. That's experiential avoidance. If I feel depressed, I'm too anxious, I can't do these things. And so maybe I go to bed, or I cannot act on those, on what I can't take action. When I evaluate something negatively, I usually recognize this is just a reaction, not an objective fact. One of the issues here is, do you see the world through your thoughts, or do you see that you have thoughts, and in the context in which you see, well, I have the thought that this couldn't possibly work out, and I can have that thought, and choose to take action anyway. That's not being experientially avoidant. And what do you think? Is this experientially avoidant? Yeah? Okay. So, experiential avoidance has been associated with all of these kinds of problems. There's now really a ton of research on this, and research showing that when you help people to stop being experientially avoidant, they become better able to do things. Anybody know what trichotillomania is? You're scratching your bald head. It's pulling your hairs out obsessively. That's trichotillomania. So the traditional moves are think positive thoughts. Control those negative thoughts and feelings. Just keep them under control. Get your psychological ducks in a row. When you're confident, you can move mountains. You just need to be confident, right? There's even a TED Talk about if you stand like this, you'll feel more confident, which is probably true for physiological and history moves. But on the other hand, if you're waiting to feel confident, you might wait a long time, and there's things to be done while you're waiting. Or shake it off. You know, that's every macho coach's slogan. But the problem is that learning never subtracts. You cannot take something away. Once a person's learned something, it's still there in their repertoire. They may have stopped doing it, but under the right conditions, it's still there. You can't get rid of it, and trying to get rid of it doesn't work. And in fact, efforts to control unwanted thoughts and feelings just magnify them. There's actually good research. A guy named Wegner at Harvard made his name on research showing that people cannot control their thoughts and feelings. And just to give you an example, I'd like you to try this. Don't think about chocolate cake, okay? I'm going to give you a minute, and I'm going to ask you to not think about chocolate cake, okay? And just to be clear what I'm talking about, this is what I don't want you to think about, okay? So I'll give you a minute, and just see if you can not think about chocolate cake. Are you ready? Go. Well, actually, I've done this enough that I think 30 seconds will do. Is there somebody who didn't think about chocolate cake? Okay. Oh, I love these. What'd you do? What happened?
I thought about lemon meringue pie. Experiences like that.
Well,
my dad's favorite pie.
Well, that's better than the lady who told me she thought about chocolate mousse. I said, well, that's impressive. So let me ask you this. If what you set out to not think about was some terrible thing that you had done, would it work to walk around trying to think about lemon meringue pie all day?
I suspect it wouldn't be very effective.
I don't think so.
It's not addressing the issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, but that's very often what people are doing, is just trying to use all their energy to not think about things that they don't want to have in their lives. And it doesn't work. What does seem to work is when we help people to become more accepting of these things. And the psychological flexibility is this notion of not being experientially avoidant, but instead pursuing your values, even in the context in which your mind is telling you that this could be difficult, this could be impossible. You can make your life about pursuing things, and your life can be meaningful in the pursuit of those things, even when you do not achieve them. So this is the one version of psychological flexibility. So first is being aware, and that is defined by contact with the present moment and self as context. And I'm going to come back to that because that's Ellen may need Ellen's help. There's a lady here who knows more about this than I do. So. But being open and being engaged. So let me start over here. Psychological flexibility is a matter about being clear about your values and taking action in pursuit of those values. Okay? And what often gets in the way are the thoughts and feelings that we have, and what the psychological flexibility is about is being open to the thoughts and feelings that often get in the way of our doing the things that we value. So I value a loving relationship with my father, who was this mean person, but I can't stand the thought that he might again reject me. And so I won't even try to reach that relationship. But being open is to accept whatever thoughts and feelings you have. And diffusion is the notion of sort of stepping back, not being fused with your thoughts. If I'm fused with my thought that I could get anxious going to the mall, then I may see the mall through that thought, and it actually will make it more likely that I'll become anxious. But if I can step back and get good at noticing that I have that thought, oh, that's a thought that I'm having, and I can still choose to go to the mall. And if I have the thought that I'll really have a panic attack, I can have that thought too, and I can go to the mall. And I can choose to go to the mall and have a panic attack because I choose to be at the mall. So that's being open to our thoughts and feelings without struggling to control them. Now we come up to awareness, and this is really valuable because contact with the present moment is, here we are in this room, and I'm talking, and most of you are listening, some of you are sleeping, and here we are, and you can hear my voice, and you can feel, you can probably hear things I can't hear, and you can feel the temperature in this room, and you can look around and so on. You can be in this moment. And being in this moment is different from being in your head about whether or not you're going to be anxious, or you're going to be depressed, or you're going to flunk a test, or this talk isn't going to go well, or whatever. And so contact with the present moment is in some ways can be a sort of antidote to being in your head worrying about things that you can't control anyway. And the self is context. Oh, Ellen. Okay, let me do this. Let me ask you to, and I'll ask you to just, when you've got an image, to just raise your hand. I won't call on anyone. You won't have to share anything or anything like that. But let me ask you to think about a time when you were a child, a young child, And when you have just an image of when you were a young child, just raise your hand. Okay, good. So now let me ask you to think about a time when you were a teenager, and just something that happened to you when you were a teenager. Okay. And now think about something that happened in your life where you were really sad. Okay? And think about something that happened last week that you really enjoyed. Okay? So here's the question. Who's thinking about all these things? Say it out loud. You're thinking about them, right? Isn't that the experience you had? And weren't you the same person when you thought about all of those things? And isn't there a sense in which when you were a little girl and you had that experience, isn't there a sense in which the you that experienced that, there's some continuity, that the you that's experiencing my talking right now is the same person who was experiencing that. You've changed in many ways, but there's a sense in which I, that have these experiences, doesn't change. It's unchanging. This is the sense of spirituality, because this I is no thing. You can't look at it. You know, you're always seeing from it. And that I is what has come to be called the self as context, which is, I'm not sure, I should just get rid of self as context and say the I. But the work that's been done on this has been helping people to get it, that this I is different from any of those thoughts and feelings. And the reason that that's important is that if this I stays the same, even when I'm in the mall having a panic attack, then it doesn't change and nothing can hurt me. That me that experiences things. And so, for example, one of the metaphors in this approach that's been common is to think about your life like it's a chessboard. And it's a chess game, and you're playing chess, and see if it isn't the case that in this chess game it goes infinitely out in all directions, and the pieces are your thoughts and feelings and experiences and so on. And so think about it that some of the pieces are like pieces you like, I have a good retirement account, and my wife loves me, and I have a cat named Charlie who sits on my lap when I write, the good pieces. And then there are the bad pieces, like, I did a terrible job on this, and, I'm getting old, and, all kinds of things. And see if it isn't the case that sometimes you sort of nominate some of the pieces are the good pieces, and you want those pieces in your life. And then there are the bad pieces. I failed in my first marriage. I was not as good a father as I could have been. Give me time and I'll give you a lot of stuff that I could, is there on my chessboard. And so sometimes you go, well, okay, what we've got to do is we've got to get rid of those pieces. There's the bad pieces. I don't want those pieces. We're going to get rid of them. Good luck. It's infinitely in all directions. You can't get rid of them. But suppose you aren't any of those pieces. What might you be? I gave it away at the beginning. Suppose you're the board. What does a good chessboard do? It just holds all those things, right? And there's a sense in which you can hold all this stuff and you don't have to struggle with it. It can just be there. And in that context, you can choose to do what you want to do and make your life about what you want it to be about. So that's sort of a teaspoon of psychological flexibility, but this lady you should talk to because she lives in Colorado and she knows this stuff better than I. This is Ellen Lewis, and she got me to be on the list. There are listservs of people all over the world talking about this stuff, and she got me to be on the listserv having to do with health. She's a physician, and there's this stuff is penetrating medicine. So do what matters: values, goals, and committed action. Okay, so here's the question, and let's do it this way. Does everybody have a copy of this? If you don't, here. Anybody else need any? So this is a simple approach, but Let's do it like this. What I've become really concerned about is how we find ways to help people to repair and nurture caring relationships with other people. And if you got a loving spouse or a good friend or a sister or brother and so on, you don't need this. But if you've got a relationship that could be better, actually, let me do it this way. Would you raise your hand if you've ever found yourself lying in bed, stressing about someone who was not lying next to you? It's the human condition, right? Okay. So that's the kind of relationship I'd like you to think about in this exercise. Think about some specific person that you have uncomfortable feelings about, you're dissatisfied with, you wish you had a better relationship with that person. Okay? And in the bottom right quadrant, I'd like you to write down what your values are about that relationship. If that relationship were as good as it could be, what would it be like? Just put down some words that describe what that might be like. It's coming in and out, is that? Oh. There seem to be dead spots in the...
Yeah, that's crazy. If you want to clip that out, then I'll turn it on. Give that a try.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you got something there? So this is the answer in this narrow, I've narrowed this down to a relationship with one other person. But the generic thing is, what do you want your life to be about? You can take this and you could do this with any aspect of your life or all aspects of your life. What do you want your life to be about? Right? And there are a lot of exercises that we've developed to help people to think that through. Like if 5 years from now they had a party for you honoring you for the things that you had done, what would you want them to say? Or a completely different one, if it turned out that anything you did, and people would say, it's fine. You rob banks, you assault people, you steal, it's fine. We love you, right? If that were the case, what would you want your life to be about? Interesting question. Okay, so anybody willing to give examples? You don't have to by any means, but anybody willing to say what their values are about relationships with this problematic person who keeps you awake at night?
I value honesty.
Honesty? Okay. Honesty? Louder, I can't hear.
I just said loving, supportive, and available.
Loving, supportive, and available. Okay. Others? Anybody want to kill this person? Anybody want to hurt this person? It's probably a bad bet, right? I mean, as you sit here and you think, this person who's really been mean to me, it's probably not in my best interest to kill this person, even when I feel like that. That's a thought I can have, and I can try to build a better relationship with this person. Okay? All right, so next we go here, the lower left quadrant, and I'd like you to simply write there thoughts and feelings that you have that tend to move you away from building the valued relationship that you'd like to have. Am I clear in what I'm saying? Notice that the arrows are toward and away. And so, what thoughts and feelings move you away from pursuing this valued relationships? So are there thoughts and feelings that tend to move you away from doing the things that might move you forward?
Fear and uncertainty.
Fear and uncertainty. They won't listen to me. They won't be responsive to what I desire. Mhm. Other people have that kind of reaction? Yeah. Others?
Resentment, anger, hostility, or apathy.
The hell with them, or damn that person, or, right. And all that moves you away from pursuing those values. Okay, so now we go to the upper left-hand quadrant. What behaviors might you engage in when you have those kinds of thoughts and feelings that move you away from building the relationship with that person? Anybody willing to volunteer? Nice and loud. Procrastination. I could repair that relationship, but there's a basketball game on I need to watch. Others?
Sense of sadness.
Sense of sadness. It just feels sad and kind of goes with that. Arguing, right?
Right?
Yep, right. Being right. Being right's very important to people, myself included. So, okay, so this is basically taking this whole thing and breaking it down into these 4 things. And the last one in the upper right-hand quadrant is, can you think of something you could do that would contribute to improving that relationship, even in the context of the thoughts and feelings and the behavioral urges you have? Can you think of something you could do that could improve that relationship? Any ideas? Forgiveness. Funny you should mention that. I think that's fundamental.
So just saying and doing what I can do without thinking about what the other person is going to do. But
Choosing to live your values in relation to that person, whatever they do.
What I'm actually responsible for.
Yes.
Versus, right.
That guy that taught me that it's better to miss lunch than to be lunch. I roomed with him in Sweden at a conference on this stuff. Kelly, he's too cheap to buy his own room, and he helped me to do exactly that with my son. He got me to stop struggling with my son and simply accept him, even as I continued to get feedback over a number of years with diminishing frequency of feedback that, he thought I didn't trust him, he thought I didn't approve, and so on, which was the results of 20 years of my being his father, not, just letting go and just caring for him. So, and it improved our relationship greatly. So, somebody said forgiveness, and I want to talk about that because I've been thinking a lot about that. Self-compassion is good, but let's talk about this. How do we nurture nurturing relationships? So there's this old sexist, ageist story about Stephen Hawking tells about, he's given a lecture on the origins of the universe. You know, heard this story? And so he's explained the origins of the universe, and he's done, and this little old lady, ageist, sexist story, in the front raises her hand and says, yes, but isn't it the case that the universe is on the back of a turtle? And he goes, well, yes, but what's the turtle? And he says, no, Sonny, I'm on to that. It's turtles all the way down. So I often think of that story when I'm thinking about, okay, how do we help parents to become more nurturing toward their children by teaching them to be patient, by teaching them less harsh ways of disciplining, by teaching them to be reinforcing, by teaching them to listen and communicate with their children, all of these kinds of things. And how do you do that with a parent who has been, let's say, accused of abusing their child? Do you do it by saying, you know, you are an abusive parent and this is a terrible thing and you should be ashamed of yourself, and if you don't stop being that way, we are going to take your child away and you will never see that child. You won't be able to see that child without an adult here. How well do you think that would work? So it turns out that if we want to help parents to be more nurturing, it doesn't pay to punish them either. We have to be nurturing toward them. Now, how much does the average public mental health worker make? Is anybody really wealthy having done therapy in a public mental health setting? I don't think so, right? Teachers. We used to pay teachers. We don't pay teachers so much anymore, right? We don't. I mean, we don't, not only do we not pay them as much as we pay them, we don't value them as much as we pay them. We don't recognize them and so on, right? But we don't want them to be mean to our kids. And if they're stressed, that's their problem. We don't want them, you know, they should be positively reinforcing. Damn it. So that's not working. So it turns out we need to be nurturing toward the teachers, and we need to be nurturing toward the parents, and we need to be nurturing toward the mental health workers. And everywhere you look, we need to be nurturing. And if you say, well, you know, part of the reason, you know, I keep saying we need nurturing families in schools, but if you really follow that out, Mom just came home from working for, what are we working for now? $9 an hour at McDonald's, and that was her second job. And Dad is maybe not there, and she's kind of stressed, right? I mean, look at what we're doing. We're not nurturing people, and we need to be doing that. And so you go to McDonald's, and you buy something, and there's a human being selling it to you. And that human being, I mean, in your heart of hearts, in your values, isn't that human being just as important as every other human being? I mean, you truly believe that. But then, you know, I mean, what do? You drive by these people that are begging in the street. What do you do? This is very stressful. And I don't have, you know, the complete answer to that by any means. But I do think that we need to encourage everyone in society to realize that everybody you're interacting with has a kid at home, has a husband that left, has a dad that, you know what, you know, I mean, all these kinds of things. Everybody's got a story, and everybody's got pain and suffering. And we need to be caring toward all those people if we want to create the kind of society that's nurturing. So that's why nurturing relationships seems so important to me. So we've already done this. See, if I hadn't had the Manhattan, this would have been much better organized. But I might not have been, okay. So this is in my book, but the 10th chapter in this book is called In Caring Relationships with Others. And I just feel, the first half of the book are, here are all these preventive interventions that I talked about earlier that could really make a difference. And the second half of the book, the second part of the book is, okay, here's how we affect entire populations. Because it's not enough to just be, I'm a good therapist with you and you're better, and oh, now I'm a good therapist with you. How many therapists are we going to need to work our way out of this? It's just not enough. And so we need a public health approach. We need to be concerned about the entire population, and we need to do anything we can to affect that population. Not just programs, but policies that change the economic well-being of families and so on. But one of the things that we need to do is to work on these relationships. So The 10th chapter, the third part of the book, is called In Caring Relationships with Others, which is a phrase from the Institute of Medicine report on prevention. So Charles Robert stormed an Amish school and killed 5 young schoolgirls before he killed himself. The Amish community expressed its forgiveness by attending his funeral and raising money for Robert's widow and 3 small children. Now think about that. There's a description of this that I read where the grandfather of one of the children who was killed held the father of Robert's for an hour as he cried and cared for him. And think about, they raised money for this family, and those 3 small children will have to go through their lives knowing that their father did this horrendous thing. And which will be better for them? Knowing that the Amish people hate them, or realizing that the Amish people have forgiven them and don't blame them? That to me is, that's the real test. Now think back to the person that you were thinking about in that little exercise. And if they can forgive Roberts, maybe there's some slack of forgiveness of that person that might actually work to improve that relationship. And then there's Mohandas Gandhi, who vowed to fast until all violence between Hindus and Muslims ended. And a Hindu man came to him and confessed that he had killed a Muslim boy as revenge for the killing of his own son. And he implored Gandhi to end his fast because he didn't want to have Gandhi's death on his soul. And Gandhi told him that he could atone for his sin by finding a Muslim child whose parents had been killed in the religious riots and raising that child as a Muslim. And Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement to end segregation, in which people did not respond with aggression. They simply asserted their rights and their desires in a nonviolent way. And that so moved the rest of the country that there was sufficient support that we ended segregation, which is not to say that there's not a lot left to be done there. But again, this was a selfless thing that produced sympathy and support from enough Americans to end segregation. And in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for, 20 years, was punished certainly by the whites in South Africa. He created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the many wrongs that have been done during apartheid. And the commission invited victims of apartheid to give statements about their experiences. Perpetrators of violence were also invited to give testimony and could request amnesty from both civil and criminal prosecutions. The process is generally credited with having prevented much violence. So here are examples of things people did that were aversive, that the other person stepped over, that the other person went around, that the other person didn't choose to respond with the natural aggression which is just built into the human genome. It can be done. And here's my last one. You see why that's the same? The mother chooses not to slap the kid or neglect the kid, but to change that child's diaper. So there are probably hormones that help with that. We might want to distribute them to the men in the society. My next book is going to be The Future of Men. There's more men here than I've talked to probably 500 people in the last month. There's more men here than I've seen. Congratulations, men. Oh, but wait, it's Monday night. Is the NBA, there are no playoff games tonight? So, compassion is a basic human kindness accompanied by an awareness of the suffering of oneself and other living beings, coupled with a wish and an effort to relieve it. That's a paraphrase of Paul Gilbert's definition of compassion. And I think compassion is essential to building the kinds of relationships we need. And acceptance is not merely tolerance, it's the active, non-judgmental embracing of experience in the here and now. Embracing, acceptance is not just, oh yeah, I feel really bad, but oh, I feel bad, and I can embrace that. I can accept that in the sense of not just that I'm going to tolerate it, but that I'm leaning into it. Acceptance involves undefended exposure to thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations. You really can do that. And I've taken clients through this and come out the other end, and they just didn't believe that they could ever get beyond the anxiety that they were struggling with. So compassion toward ourselves and others. I think there are two key behavioral skills. And these come from two dear friends of mine, Peter and Susan Glazer, who are billing at about $8,000 a day, working with high-end companies on dealing with conflict. So, this stuff is working for a lot of people. And they're dear friends, and they have taught me this, and I'm not very good at it, but this is responding to criticism. I mean, how much, if you've got somebody that you have unpleasant relationships with, how much is some negative feedback from them involved in that difficult relationship, okay? So what the Glazers do, they're just behaviorists. They say, okay, this happens, you do that, right? So you get more information, active listening, nonverbal attention, a posture of curiosity. And would anybody like to be the critical person in this? Anybody willing to? Let's see, we need to invent something. You're willing to be critical? Sure. Thank you. So, okay, what might the situation be?
I can be this one right now. I can be this one right now.
Okay.
Your name tag is upside down and it's been bugging me all night.
Oh.
And that
So-
microphone
So you're
keeps
saying,
going in and out, oh my gosh. I've
okay.
not been able to concentrate on the thing you're
So
saying.
this microphone?
Yes.
Oh, so you'd rather have this in here?
No, the sound is going in and out.
Oh,
Now
yes,
you bring up
yes.
the wire, that bugs me too.
Oh, that must really be annoying, because there are certain places I stand and you can't hear me as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I appreciate that. Now let's see. Did I come to do marital counseling? The number of workshops that I have done where we have things at the end and give us feedback and so on, and the number of times that a guy has written, my wife could really use this. And I always go, well, the best way you could give it to her would be to get it yourself. Okay, so the name tag is troubling, yes, and the in and out sound, and this,
Yes.
yes, okay. And let's see, I need notes here.
Are you drunk? I totally get it.
No, I can safely say I'm not. And I would say I soon will be, but I got to talk tomorrow, so I don't think that's going to happen. So your concern is to be able to hear me better. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can concentrate on what you're saying.
And to be more focused on to help you to.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So
Thank you for changing your name tag too.
my experience with name tags is but would you tell me the next time that it?
Gladly.
Because seek out agreement wherever it exists. So in other words, the end of listening to somebody about their complaints and showing that you're listening and truly listening and not just your posture, but your paraphrasing and so on, the end of that is, okay, so what would be better? How could we do this better the next time? And so you can repair that relationship, right? What the Glazers do is they go into an organization and they get vignettes of common fights that people are having, and then they role play them themselves, and they're both actors. They were both on Broadway before they got into this business. And they show people how you can do this, and now I got 2 microphones. You know how hard this is? And here's the other one, raising delicate issues. So, you don't want to just, a couple things. The first thing is you want to have an opportunity to discuss your concern without just sort of jumping into it and, and ambushing the person about it. And so you indicate that you have a concern while making clear that your intention is not to hurt the other person. you know, I'd really like to talk to you about the concerns that you seem to have with me. My wife runs a preschool for kids with developmental disabilities, and she had one classroom that she goes to. She's the director of the preschool, and she's a marvelous teacher and a very nurturing person. And but she knew that this one assistant was sort of a ringleader, and that these 3 assistants really didn't like her. And the difficulty is that she'll come in and she'll work with an autistic kid who's just out of control, and when she's done, at least for her, this child is not out of control. Well, you know, you could say, oh, gee, I see what you're doing, that's wonderful, or I don't know how you did that, or this kid just happens to be having a good day. But all of that is about, oh, I feel like I'm being evaluated, and she comes in and makes me feel bad. You know, so Georgia understood that. And so she used exactly these strategies and said, you know, I can see that you're troubled with me, and I'd like you to give me some feedback about that, because that would be helpful to me. And so, and you edit out accusative language, because what people will typically do is they say, you just don't like me, right? Well, don't like me is not a behaviorally specific example. And so what you're trying to do is get people to be specific about the things they're doing. Well, the other day, when I was talking, you interrupted me. Oh, okay, I interrupted you. So now we're getting down to specific things, and I can do something about that. I can change my behavior, and you know, there's some learning taking place. So pinpoint the details. Describe exactly what the other person said or did when they said or did it. Not, you know, you're not competent, or you're not, you know, you're not prepared might be okay, but it'd be better if it were, you know, you come in and you haven't done a lesson plan, and you're supposed to be doing a lesson plan. That would be more specific. And then acknowledge your part. Search for and communicate what you may have done that contributed to the problem. Always make clear that you own this problem and that you are a player in this, and what can I do differently, and then try to agree on a solution. And I will tell you, if you go to the Glazer's website, it's Glazer and Associates or something, you'll see videos, excellent videos, examples of these kinds of skills. So I guess to sort of summarize, I would say that what I'm learning about improving interpersonal relationships is that if we can become better able to have the thoughts and feelings that we have, even when they're unpleasant and we wish we didn't have them, and we can be clearer about our values, and we can act and get better at acting on our values, even when we're not so sure this is going to work, that seems to be one of the things we need to improve human relationships. And that the other are some specific skills that have to do with listening and being one of the parties in this relationship that has as many things that you're doing wrong as the other person is doing. So, did you want to talk about any more about your relationship? I'll tell you a story instead, because you didn't ask for me to give you therapy. So I got into this stuff in the 1980s when Steve Hayes sent me a chapter about this stuff, and it described people that I had worked with that I hadn't been successful with. I was fairly successful in treating anxiety and depression, but there were some people who you taught them to relax, and they just used it to try to not be anxious, and trying to not be anxious didn't work. And so I got into this, and my wife Georgia got into it, and over the years we've been more and more into it, and we've been married for 40 years, and it does get better, and it's taken a long time. But I'll leave you with this one story, because it sort of captures how this stuff has evolved for us. We had this cat, Mipos, and Mipos was diabetic. Now, my wife nurtures cats and plants and children and people, adults, you know. So this cat needed to have insulin twice a day. So one day, she had to leave early, and I was supposed to give Mipos her shot in the morning. I forgot to do it. So she gets home in the evening, and I tell her I forgot to do it. So at some point, she comes to me with the food dish prepared and the syringe prepared, and she hands them to me. And she doesn't say anything. And I was so angry and so humiliated. I mean, she was absolutely right. I was supposed to do it. I didn't do it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. And we were feeding the cats upstairs. So I went up the stairs and I was just so angry. And I went and I gave Mipos the shot. And as I was walking up the stairs, I was noticing what I felt, which was anger and humiliation, and I was wrong, and guys don't like to be wrong. And I realized that I could do what we had done on many occasions over our relationship over many years, which is go downstairs and sit at the other end of the sofa and watch TV and not talk to her and get in bed and be on my side of the bed and not touch her. Is this familiar? And maybe we wouldn't talk for 2 days, you know? I mean, we were certainly capable of that. And I realized that I didn't want that I wanted a warm, loving relationship, so I just said, oh, and let go of it, you know? Okay, I screwed up, and went downstairs and we cuddled and watched TV and it was fine. It's amazing how you can accept these things that you may have struggled your whole life to not have and have better relationships because of it. Because those thoughts and feelings you have, even if they say, and you did this and you did that, if you can get good with this mindfulness, I'm sorry, the sound just went out, but I'm doing the best I can. But if you can mindfully accept, I didn't hear that, fortunately I don't hear that. Hey, I'm going to get worse as an older man, right? If you can accept those thoughts and feelings as thoughts and feelings and just sort of mindfully accept that and say, oh yes, and what was it that I wanted in this relationship, you can build better relationships. And I think that that's one of the fundamental building blocks for creating a nurturing society. And so I think on that note, I should shut up and thank you for your attention and your patience.